I'm not a quilter. As Mabon mentioned, I'm a judge, or was. But several years ago, I stumbled into a different kind of quilting story from those that you've heard so far at this symposium. The quilts that you see here today, over on my right and over on my left, are called the So Their Names quilts. And they are the result of a very recent and still ongoing project by the same name. Before I explain these further, I do want to play a short video to introduce you to some quilters who meet on Thursdays in this old church building in the tiny, unincorporated town of Mount Willing in Lowndes County, which was founded back in the early 1800s and is about 45 minutes southwest of Montgomery. And in the video, you'll also see briefly Wini McQueen and Yvonne Wells, and of course, you'll hear from them in a moment. But the following is a teaser for a longer documentary film that is currently in the works. And we cue Mabon again.
Somebody's calling mine. Oh, hush, hush. Somebody's calling my name. Hush, Lordy now. Hush, Lordy now. Somebody's calling my name. Oh,
I heard the word "so their names," and it didn't really ring a bell like nothing does at first for most things. But I kept thinking about it, and I knew that names were a very serious issue in the series Roots. When you think about Kente Kunte. And I knew that many of my friends had changed their names, and those who hadn't had all given African names to their children. A name is the most important thing you have. It stays with you for your life. If you go to a cemetery, there's no body, there's no bone, there's no photo, there's no history written, there's just a name.
When you heard the song Hush, we were talking about that with the quilt. Somebody's calling my name, oh my Lord, what shall I do? So who's calling you? Is it the slave? Was it the slave owner calling your name? Was it the one over you calling your name? Was it Jesus calling your name? And you had to make a decision, am I going to answer? When I look at all the names that were being embroidered, and names, I think about my sister telling me about my ancestors, and how when they came in on the slave ships, slave owner, named them all the same. So they had no identity. But then as they started to migrate and move around, they got a first name and then the slave owner's last name. But then their names didn't mean anything because they were mispronounced, they were spelt wrong, the genders didn't mean anything, you were property. When will we stop looking at ourselves as somebody's property?
Soon we'll be gone with the troubles of this world. Troubles of this world. Troubles of this world. Sometimes, every now and then when I come, I just be so down and depressed, like. And once I hear all that singing and stuff, I'm good to go. I'm a new person. I'm going home. Oh, I enjoy the singing. The music, the gospel, I enjoy, everything about it. It makes me feel, real good to hear the music, hear singing while I'm quilting. Quilting became sort of like a recreation center in a rural community. Although it met one day a week, it was something that they would look forward to. And strangely enough, after my mom passed, quilting became my piece. It became my connection to her.
To live for Jesus all of my days. I got a mind to live for Jesus all of my days. Oh yes. And
I quit because I enjoy doing it. I just love sewing. And with quilting, you know, all these different colors going together, it's kind of exciting.
all of my life.
I like quilting.
I got a
It help me relax. Because a lot of time I'll go to bed at night. Sometimes I stay up all night sewing. And then when I get through doing that, I might lay down for a while. Then I get up. Start again.
I quilt because it gives me something positive to do. And it also creates beauty for others that receive what we do.
I quilt because I grew up in this environment. I came from this old-fashioned way of doing things in my life. And it makes me happy. And I look at my work, what I've learned from my mom and the old women back in the day, and it instilled it in me to do what I'm doing today. And I love it. And as God gives me what I need, I'm going to do it as long as I can. I have a slogan. If you learned, teach someone else to listen. If you've done, teach someone else to do. If you've helped somebody, teach someone else to help somebody else. This will give people an opportunity to see people who were lost, and now that they are found, and others can come and give them the honor which they deserve. This project is going to touch many bases, many people, in many places, and I hope when they leave away from this place, they will go, sit, think, remember, and do better.
Like Jesus, Lord, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? Shall I do? Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Like somebody calling my name.
There we go. Feel like I could just stop there. So what relevance does this old spiritual hush, somebody's calling my name, have to these quilts here? And what names are we talking about? Well, my task is to tell you something about the history of those names, what they represent, and how we found them, and how we started this project. And then Ms. McQueen and Ms. Wells will tell you their own stories about the quilts they've made. So my part of the story began back in 2018 when I called this man, Reverend Dale Braxton, whom you also saw in the video, out of the clear blue sky. And we had never met before, but what prompted the call was I had just seen this form online that said that his church, I'm going to talk a lot of churches, there are all kind of churches in this place, but this is the Snow Hill Christian Church, also in Mount Willing, you saw on the other slide, owned this building nearby. This building was once called the Hopewell Baptist Church. It was built by enslaved workers before the Civil War, around 1843. And it may not look like a church. Let's see if we can click it. With no steeple or cross or stained glass. But Baptist meeting houses at this time were intentionally austere and plain. Reformed churches distrusted ornament and all of the other trappings of the Anglican and Catholic traditions. But once you're up close, you realize this is in fact a quite imposing structure with more than 20-foot high ceilings that dwarf these guys in the front. So I knew that my great-great-grandfather, Reverend David Lee, who was born in 1805, had founded this church and preached in this building for over 50 years. There's a photo of his son, David Lee, Jr. He has to stand in for David Lee because the other one didn't believe in photographs, which is really inconvenient for those of us who follow. But what I didn't know and read for the first time online in 2018 was that Reverend Lee's church at one time had a slave gallery. Well, what exactly is a slave gallery? As many of you probably know, these were balconies built to segregate enslaved black worshipers from white members. Most of them have since been removed, as is the case with the Hopewell Church, but a few are still around. The slave gallery was the preeminent architectural strategy for the control of enslaved persons in mixed-race churches. It took different forms, some more imposing than others. The distinction between slave and master actually might be enforced right down to the architectural level in these galleries. For example, at this 1851 church in Dallas County, this is hard to see, but I promise you it's there. The outside of the doors to the slave gallery stairs, which we'll see in a moment, and the front of the gallery itself were expensively paneled and painted because they were seen by whites. But the inside of the doors and the stairs to the slave gallery, used only by slaves, were of the most basic construction and never painted. Of course, the enslaved builders were responsible for the fine workmanship, too, so it's not like they didn't know what it was or appreciate the skill involved. In fact, that was their skill on display. Here are those stairs to the slave gallery. In this church's sanctuary, all the baseboards were a dark faux marble. Obviously, in the slave stairs, there's a baseboard. There's not a dark faux marble that I can see there. Slave galleries were often accessed by stairs like this that could be very steep and narrow. Sometimes the stairs even had to be climbed outside the building. You can see them up there. And I've been up that set of stairs. It is really hard to get up there. The slave galleries frequently were crowded, unheated, and unventilated. Blacks sometimes sat on cramped, backless benches on risers. And here are actually two examples of such benches that remain in churches in Dallas County. I think they're the only ones I've ever seen that are left. Services could run for hours, so seating mattered, and the white members typically had these wider pews with backs, like this one in our Hopewell Church, often with cushions added. Also, at times, as the slave narratives recount, enslaved members might not even have benches. They would be compelled to sit on the floor or stand while whites sat down. Sometimes, instead of using a balcony, a church might just rail or partition off a space in the back of the church to segregate enslaved persons. This is a picture of the, I don't know if it's Cubahatchee or Cubahatchee. Church is very near Auburn and shorter. This is an antebellum structure, but the one right before this, we know that blacks had to crowd into a space of 12 feet behind a railing at the very rear of the sanctuary. At one point there was a vote and they got to have 15 feet. These notches here, maybe I wonder if we need to, can we remove that side part? Not that critical, but these are in the Hopewell Church that I mentioned at the beginning. We found remarkable evidence of a railed slave section in that church. These are the notches or mortise holes cut into the walls and floor to hold that railing. And we found them behind the boards. A few churches such as this one even compelled enslaved members to worship in separate basements under white supervision. If more enslaved members were present than could be seated in these segregated spaces, they had to leave the church without hearing the service and stay outside the building. I do have to add that enslaved church members sometimes actually were able to capitalize on that opportunity to socialize. One Baptist pastor in Dallas County lamented that because the slave galleries were too crowded and uncomfortable, blacks would not pay attention to the preacher and instead talked and fell asleep and left the gallery and strolled around or came in just at the end of the service. Another Baptist church in Wilcox County resolved, as they said, to appoint a committee of vigilance or vigilantes on account of much disorder by the blacks on Sabbaths of our meetings. So you can already see the signs of black resistance brewing within these churches long before the civil rights movement. Historically, slave galleries and railings are particularly important because some scholars believe that Jim Crow segregation actually originated not during Reconstruction, but instead much earlier, as one authority put it, in the systematic separation of the races in the churches while blacks were still enslaved. And once you're aware of that history, you can see how photos such as these of segregated entrances and balconies from the mid-20th century quite eerily invoke the slave galleries in the antebellum church. Although enslaved persons were actively forbidden by some slaveholders to join the church, many did attend mixed-race churches, sometimes by compulsion, but probably more often voluntarily, if the word voluntary has any meaning under those circumstances. Particularly in the Black Belt, black members actually might far outnumber white members, which is one reason that whites had slave galleries built to control access and seating and behavior. In Montgomery, for example, First Baptist Church, in 1862, this is the old church on the left, had 226 white and 438 black members. And Elam, on the right, had 23 white members and 527 black members. Later on, that became a black church. In antebellum mixed-race churches, some of which at the time you could, I think, more fairly call black churches rather than white churches, because of the sheer numbers, those churches persisted in Alabama and elsewhere for more than 50 years. These many, many decades of black history in the Southern Church, unfortunately, are too little known. The records from that time are mostly hidden in obscure so-called church books, and they reveal not only the roots of segregation in the antebellum church, but also the beginnings of black resistance. You can clearly see in the racially determined order of meal service at dinners on the grounds, or order of taking communion in the antebellum churches, the foreshadowing of the segregated lunch counter. You can see in the racially divided antebellum procession from the plantations to church on Sunday, with whites in wagons and carriages and enslaved persons walking separately on foot, a very early manifestation of segregation in transportation. And you can clearly observe in strictly separated Sunday schools and the different catechisms used for white and black children, the origins of later school segregation. Antebellum churches, in which most business was conducted in conference by voice vote, also restricted voting rights by race, or often did, prefiguring later Jim Crow vote suppression. So the revelation that my own relative, this prominent Baptist minister who preached Christian love and charity had required enslaved persons to build their own segregated seating and then to worship there, apart from the white members, hit me hard when I learned it. That is difficult history, and I understand that some people don't like to recall it. But I don't believe it's something we should just sweep under the rug and pretend either that it didn't happen or it didn't matter. My great-great-grandfather's obituary said that he preached and wrote the truth as he understood it and left results to the God whom he served. It also said that though he was a charitable man, he had an integrity that would not spare his best friend in the wrong. So, in the spirit of honesty and justice that Reverend Lee himself endorsed, let the truth-telling begin. Reverend Lee was not only a pastor, he was what one author called a crack farmer. Cultivated around 1,100 acres, mostly in cotton, about a mile from the Hopewell Church. Of course, the way he succeeded at that was with the labor of 25 enslaved workers, 16 males and 9 females, ages 1 to 55. For context, the typical Alabama slaveholder held fewer than 5 slaves. And many other influential Baptist preachers held far, far more persons in bondage. The same skilled enslaved craftsman who built the Hopewell Church in 1843 also built Reverend Lee a plantation house, not in great shape at this point. A few years later, it took 5 or 6 years to complete. It had 14-foot ceilings, 6 chimneys, rooms furnished with rosewood and mahogany, a garden of tropical and desert plants from Texas and Mexico, a kitchen, a carpenter shop, spinning room, stables, coach house, smokehouse, grape arbor, orchard, and 2 slave dwellings. And you look at the scale of the house you can see the people standing down there on the left. So I knew that Reverend Braxton, whom you met on the video earlier, wanted to restore the Hopewell Church and tell its history. And I knew who some of the white members were. But who were the enslaved members? Were they simply erased from history without any trace? The slave schedules, the census data for 1850 and 1860, showed no names for persons enslaved by Reverend Lee or any other white church members, only numbers and genders and age. Slave names are in fact quite scarce, hard to find in the scattered documents that have survived, like wills and plantation inventories and sometimes slave narratives. So I dug around in the dusty archives of the Baptist Church at Samford University in Birmingham. Turns out Baptist churches kept meticulous records. Years ago, Samford collected all of these it could find for Alabama. Unfortunately, there were no membership records from the Hopewell Church. But that church turned out to be very closely related to and part of a larger group of churches called the Alabama Baptist Association. And that included almost all of Dallas, Lowndes, and Montgomery counties, and parts of Macon, Elmore, Autauga, Wilcox, and Butler counties. In all, perhaps 35 to 40 or so churches were in this association at any given time. The association was among the most active apologists for slavery in the state. It even literally owned a slave itself for 17 years, an enslaved preacher named Caesar Blackwell, whom it purchased for $624 in 1829. I'm sorry, I didn't quite get to his grave. So this group was the most powerful Baptist association in the state. It dominated state Baptist life, they said. My great-great-grandfather served as its moderator or president for 40 years, from 1845 to 1885. And as one writer said, he exerted a commanding influence in that large and powerful association. The white membership of these association churches included not only the most famous pastors, but also governors, chief justices, and university presidents such as these men, many of whom also had important roles in the Confederacy. And I can't help but particularly point out Isaac Tishner on the left because of where we are today. He was an influential pastor at First Baptist Church Montgomery, a combat chaplain for the Confederacy, a staunch defender of slavery, and also the first president of what would become Auburn University. In fact, historians generally agree that from 1830 to the end of the Civil War, the most vigorous defense of slavery issued from Southern pulpits. In 1845, these individuals, including Reverend David Lee, led Southern Baptists in splitting from Northern Baptists over slavery, which many believe was the rehearsal for secession itself. But that's not all I found out. I learned that there's a substantial record of resistance in these churches by enslaved members who sometimes successfully persuaded white pastors to let them preach the gospel publicly themselves, and who also conducted their own secret services in the quarters or in the woods. I also learned that after the Civil War, black members exited these mixed churches en masse to start their own churches. This was not as some might believe because whites somehow kicked them out. On the contrary, whites tried very hard to keep the freedmen in church, in part to retain what control they could over them. But blacks soon insisted on leaving. And who can blame them when one hears, for example, that before the freedmen left the church that used to be here, it's just a cemetery now, in Trickham in Lowndes County, the freedmen asked to hold their own services in the building once a month, and the church agreed. But it told the black preacher he could not use the pulpit. He had to stand in front of it instead. Or this church, also in Lowndes County, which is really kind of beautiful. Who can blame blacks from leaving when you learn that in that church, New Bethel and Bragg's, the church clerk actually resigned because he did not like seeing the names of black freedmen written next to the names of whites in the Sunday school rolls of the association. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the Hopewell Church, my great-great-grandfather's church in Mount Willing, had 80 enslaved members and 144 white members. But by the early 1870s, there were 0 black members. But a black church called the Antioch Baptist Church was founded at about the same time just across the road on Highway 21. So the most interesting point to me is that Antioch, unlike Hopewell, is still in operation. In fact, many of the white-dominated churches that advocated slavery and built the slave galleries do not exist today. Ironically, white church leaders predicted, including Mr. Tishner, that black churches could not succeed without them, but in fact it was often the black churches that actually survived. Indeed, later on, some of these, like First Baptist Church in Montgomery and Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, and Mount Gillard Missionary Baptist Church in Trickham, went on to lead the civil rights movement. So even though I found no membership records for the Hopewell Church, I did make an astonishing discovery, and that's what brings us here today. Buried within these old Baptist records were pages and pages of the names of enslaved persons tied to specific locations throughout the central Black Belt. Most of these records have not been transcribed. They're largely hidden away on microfilm at Samford University, along with a few of the original church books. A handful of scholars know about them, but for the most part, the descendants of these individuals and the wider public are completely unaware. For all practical purposes, these names essentially had never seen the light of day before this project. The slave names we found from the Alabama Baptist Association come from Trickham, Benton, Burkeville, Hayneville, Braggs, and Collarine, and Lowndes County, Carloville, Pleasant Hill, and Orville in Dallas County. I think Orville was where our namesake here came from, namesake of the building. Montgomery and Hope Hull in Montgomery County, Wetumpka in Elmore County, Shorter in Macon County, and Prattville in Autauga County. The records usually show only first names like Winnie from Braggs, Peter from Benton, or Lavender from Call Irene. Although this church book from Wetumpka is an exception, it actually has last names as well. Mostly enslaved persons are merely identified by the slaveholder, such as Dempsey, servant of A.M. Calhoun in Carloville, or here, Dave, the property of George Harrison in Montgomery. The slave names usually appear in these books separately from the white names, just as black members had to worship separately. There was segregation in the church rolls and the minutes, too. So the Lowndes County Community Life Center in Mount Willing, which meets across the street from the old Hopewell Baptist Church and is headed by Reverend Dale Braxton, is home to the Mount Willing Quilters, some of whom you met on the video. Led by Reverend Braxton, they took up the challenge of sewing some of these previously erased names to commemorate them, and they asked others to join them. Few people in this audience have sewn some of those names already. They knew that a quilt was just as good a memorial as names carved in stone or a man on a horse. They secured grant support from generous funders, to include some folks also in this room, and they commissioned two prominent black quilt artists, Yvonne Wells and Wini McQueen, to create the first Sew Their Names quilts, which you see here today, and you're among the first to see them. They've only been shown before this just a short time ago in the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art. We hope there might be more quilts to follow. A group of slave names of this size has never been memorialized in this way, to our knowledge, either here or, so far as we know, in any other state. But these individuals deserve to be seen. They are not anonymous, invisible victims. They were real people with real stories and real families whose descendants are still here. They survived against incredible odds. They demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of unspeakable trauma, suffering, and loss. And we are here today to insist on their humanity, to show respect, to tell their story, and remember their names. So, Winnie?
Can you hear? So nice to be among quilters and quilt lovers. I'm a fabric artist and I dye fabric. I work with plain white fabric and create motifs and designs, and I turn those textiles into scarves, socks, t-shirts, and that's how I have made what I call a living for the last 50 years. About a year and a half ago, Gail Andrews called to say, would you consider making a quilt about people whose names were lost because of slavery? When the contract came to me, I had only 3 months to complete that quilt. And it's a good thing because it was very agonizing experience. But I thought, oh, I can do that. I've done everything. I know everything. I had traveled around Africa over the past 20 years looking at textile traditions. I had unknowingly participated in a naming ceremony in a small village in Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, West Africa. What happened is that one day I came to work. I was working on a textile project, came to work, and suddenly it was a warm, sandy day during the Hamatan season, and I heard these high-pitched voices, women singing and moving toward me. The arms were waving, and there was a rhythmic step moving toward me on the part of the women. And I thought, oh, they're coming to thank me for coming back after 19 years to do this project we envisioned. And shortly after I concluded that, somebody slipped a small bundle, a small baby in my arm. I was sitting in the only high-backed chair in the village that I had seen. You know, high-backed chairs are for white people like me in Africa, because African people sit on low stools. And the baby was just a few days old. It kind of opened one eye during the ceremony, and like infants do, new infants. And the women sang and they danced, and out came the gifts. So it was really a naming ceremony for the children. It was not a thank you for me. And I had a lot of experiences looking at African and African American culture, names, textile techniques, and traditions. So when the Mount Willing package arrived, that was when I realized that I knew nothing. I had not experienced anything until that package came. I had expected 150 embroidered swatches, and was told shortly before they arrived that there would be an additional 380 names. And I didn't know what I would do, but the people who I worked with, Gail and Susan, have been, I guess, the nicest people I have ever worked with in a commission. So I was I was at ease, but there were two other problems. I was concerned that because this work would hang indefinitely in the Mount Willing Community Center, that it would be exposed to light. And I was also concerned that that there would be questions about whether it was a quilt or not, because it doesn't have a backing. So Reverend Dale Braxton, and the Mount Willing quilters helped solve that problem quickly by accepting the task of making the backing. And they made that backing out of pieced African fabric that I had brought back with me over the years. And they all and what that would do is serve the purpose of becoming the lining for the quilt that I didn't have. And also it would serve as to shield the quilt from the sunlight as the years pass, and so they could cover this quilt with their work, which is a work of art in itself, because they begin then to make a story quilt. Now, moving toward the foundation, which you see around the edges, it's a acrylic painted foundation. And it's composed of my hand-dyed fabrics, but coated first with white pearl-like paint, which didn't satisfy me because this was not about the pearly gates. It was about the gold, the value that our people have brought to this country. And so that's why it's gold instead of pearly, as in pearly gates. Now, it is also, that concept is based on traditional African practices that go all the way back even before ancient Egypt. And what happens is that when a person dies, they are buried underneath or sometimes among their worldly goods. So when you look at this, you see the burial mound, but it is that of the enslaved person who may have had owned nothing, not even himself, but he might have actually had a fishing hook or a button or a little piece of cloth or some burlap. And if the Civil War had ended and there was no value to the money to the currency, he might have even had a little piece of Confederate money since it didn't mean anything. There's also, I guess my real favorite experience was turning the burr, which is that part that holds the cotton bowl. And it's wood-like, it's hard, and it's what is so painful if you touch it, and that's the flower, the part that people were pierced their hands on day in and day out if they were enslaved. And so where I live in Georgia and here in Alabama, the cotton gets to be a real issue, and so I couldn't help from thinking about the relationship between what happened in the cotton fields. And finally, of course, there was rebellion, and you have to look very hard to find the hand. The hand is right here. And it's painted over, and it's not necessarily meant for you to see, because it was the magic that people used in the hopes that they would one day be free. So you don't tell your master you want to be free. And I mean, I was told that by growing up by people who said, oh, we prayed under the pots that we would be free, but that because I grew up in a community where there were people who had actually been enslaved, so I learned some of those stories. Now, moving to the inner part of the rectangle is the treatment of the names that I received. There are probably maybe 150, 175 names there. And they are embroidered carefully, lovingly, and they are the memories that we have of people who were enslaved. And that is what might have been left of their spirits. I guess one of the most difficult ethical issues I've ever had to deal with was that of using someone else's work in a way where the work would be left very visible, because artists, are very egotistical, and it's just me, and we want to see what I did. And so I could not ignore the work and the insights and the experiences and the gift of fabric swatches I had received. So I left them bare, but if I had done that on my own, I would have probably painted over some of those names or layered them. But those names had to be shown because that was my job was to create a memory to restore the names. Also, there were, in my attempt to escape some of the horror of dealing with these names day by day, what I would do is I would take a break and I would just make works using the photo blueprint method and work artistically toward manipulating the X, because the X was a sign of the unknown. The X was a sign of illiteracy. But there were names that are very European oriented. There were names that were private names there that people used in the slave quarters among themselves. And also there are names that were donated in a spirit of restoration by white people who had actually had enslaved people in their families. The thing about the name is that it's kind of all you have, and when you're born, people put a lot of energy into naming you. And when you die, there's nothing left. There's no body. There's nothing except the slab, if you're lucky, with your name. African people were not recognized, but the mission of the project was to sow and to honor what was left of their memories. And it was not because of their contributions or because they didn't have a marker. It was because they were human. They are like us, and they must be remembered in the same way. Working with this was very difficult, and after a few weeks, I began thinking of what was this about. And that was when I began thinking I had heard something about somebody's calling my name. Somebody's calling my name. And I wasn't sure whether it was a title of a poem or whether it was a ditty or rhyme or something that we used from childhood. But that was the rhythm that I worked with. Somebody's calling my name. Somebody's calling my name. And after a while, when the rhythm grew so loud in my brain, I wondered whether something had happened to me in working on this, because it was difficult. I asked a few friends, call them up, because I really isolated myself in order to get through this in that time frame and to get through it just spiritually. And a couple of people said, yes, I remember. And Reverend Dale and his wife Mercedes said, oh yeah, but it didn't ring any bell. And I just kept singing and thinking. It was like, hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. It must be the thunder. Is it Jesus? And I knew we worship both. We worship the god of thunder, who was Shango. And so it was both that got me through that, because I was looking at two different cultures and how people yield and give and survive pain. Finally, Susan Walker and Josh Copples, who participated. You just heard Judge Walker came to talk to me, and boy, did she have questions. You never want a better questioner in your life. And I wondered whether I would ever hear that song sung properly again, because my voice just didn't gravitate there. I'm a painter, I'm not a singer. Let's put it like that. And it was wonderful having worked with, I felt like I had sort of met the Mount Willing quilters, and I think it's nothing less than a noble act that such a movement, the restoration of names, it will grow. I hope that it will grow. I know what I do. I won't be hushed again about it. And I'm going to, it says, what will I do? What I will do is make another quilt about names and restoring the names, our lost names. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Well, good evening, everybody. I hope I won't be so long, but I'm Yvonne Wells. And I want you to remember that name, Wells, because my name has not been erased. I don't know what I would have done if it had been, or the family would have done. Last year I was asked if I could do a quilt with the title Sew Their Names, and I said to them, no, I couldn't, because you know how I think. I said I cannot think of anything or how I could express myself to the topic of Sew Their Names, but she went on to tell me that this was an important event in history, and I like to do things in history so that we could pass them on to the next generation, so they could pass it on to the next generation, and so forth. But I agreed to do this after a while, and I said, well, you know, I make these quilts, and it's never has been my intention to hurt anybody's feeling or make anybody feel bad. I just don't. But sometimes history will do that, and we have to either accept it and move on, learn from that. Well, if you will look to your right, and the pictures here on the podium, this is called "The Worshipers Coming to Mount Willing Baptist Church" in Lowndes County. I got a chance to meet these lovely people. They were so decent, so loving. They were wanting to do something, but they didn't know very much about it until the subject came up with Susan and my next friend. Anyway, I said, well, this is about race. I said, okay, here we go. I'll do that. It's about your name. We didn't have names, Yvonne. They were erased. They were thrown away. How do I know who I am? Well, the slave owner told you who you were. So that's what we had to accept. So this is a bright Sunday on one side of the quilt. You see the sun? Beautiful sun. On the left, on the right hand, under the elder's arms is clouds. There are cloudy days and there are sunny days. It all depends on what you do on that day. But this was a Holy Sunday, one of the most segregated hours in history when it comes to church. The 11 o'clock hour, mostly 11 o'clock hour. Anyway, the gentleman that you see, he's an elder. He may be a pastor, but let's call him elder right now, because I say that because as I talk a little bit more, you're going to say, do you think, no, preacher did that? So we'll just call him elder and whatever else. But in Lowndes County, it's a poor county. And if you look at the trees that are there, you see that there are no leaves. That indicates to me that something is missing. It's not a fertile land. So the trees grew, but they were not spreading. In the middle of the quilt, you would see this church, this famous church that I tried to make. Sat it in the center of the woods, put out sidewalks, put out racks of behind black people who had to go to the back of the church to get and hear the worship, as opposed to the white people walking through the grass, some in the wagon, and some walking gently onto the front door of the church. Well, you know, if you see where the white people are walking to church, you will look at their sidewalk, and it is made very well. Nothing seems to be out of order, but you have to know that on this side is for the black folks, and it's kind of wobbly. You need to get over there and look at it, and you can tell much better. The rocks in this one were huge. They were big, they were broken, they were sharp. And then on part of it, you would find some briars. The briars were made from used snaps, so that if you stepped on it, it would have hurt your foot. Ooh, I thought that was terrible. Anyway, as they came to the church, you would come to the church, black comes to the church, and right in here you would see some purple, cement I call it, but they're made out of purple buttons. That was the entrance to the church. The church, the purple means Christ. So we are going to church through this door. But we were turned around, black folks, and sent to the back, climb up the stairs, into the door, stand, sit on the floor, or leave. That was not good. That was where it was then. On the left-hand or right-hand side, you would see that the white were walking to church here. But see this big black guy here? He was pulling a wagon. The wagon wheels had broken, but the children were on the wagon, and his instructions from the sheriff here, we can't call him Bull Connor, we'll call him Sheriff. Sheriff told him to pull. To pull. You know what the next word might have been. So we didn't say that on this. But that was the division. You over here and we over here. And on the black side of the church, there's a flower, it's a cactus. My goodness. This elder who's preaching the word of God got cactus over here so they can stick the black folks. What a man. All right, and on the left-hand side of the church, there are 3 tulips blooming beautifully. It does not hurt anybody, just beauty. So the black man extends his hand all over. He engulfs the whole quilt. All of this is mine. Black, white, field, trees, forest, all of this is mine. So I can do with them whatever I wanted to do. So he said all of the white folks, when they die, they're going to heaven. How about that? Okay, all of these, my black folks, when they die, the devil will be there to get them. Isn't that hypocritical? So he did that every Sunday. And they came as much as they could every Sunday to listen to this. But times changed, like it was said prior, that they wanted a place to worship on their own, and they therefore did that. In the right hand of this elder, he's holding the Holy Bible. In his left hand, he has his hands out, and he's giving them the middle finger. How very sad. Some of this may not be true. Some of it may be true. But I have an imagination as an artist. But that is about all we could say about that. When I tried to make this quilt, this was very difficult to do. Because like I said before, I don't try to make anything that's going to hurt anybody. But the fact that I'm sitting down realizing that this kind of thing happened was very, very hard on me. It's nothing more important than your name. I can't stop saying that. Because once you have your name, that's all. That's all you can have is your name and what it means. If my grandson would stand up, if you would bear with me, my grandson, he's back there. I want to read something that his dad gave to him 11 years ago. It says, "You got your name from your daddy. It was all he had to give. So it's yours to do now with whatever you will, as long as you live. If you lose your watch that he gave you, it can always be replaced. But a black mark on your name, son, can never be erased. It was clean the day your dad gave it to you, and a worthy name to bear. When he got it from his daddy, there was no dishonest there. So make sure you use and guide it wisely. After all is said and done, you'll be glad to name your child when it's your next and only son." Thank you.